This is the weekly Open Global Mind call for Thursday, May 21, 2026. Still, I'm barely used to saying 2026. It's like more than a quarter century into this century, and I'm like, how did that happen? Not sure, not sure. I'm reading Ada Palmer's book about the Renaissance and the myths of golden ages. She's really an interesting read. She's a spicy historian, Renaissance specialist, and among other things, she says, "Hey, we have all these warped ideas of the Renaissance. Uh, One of which is that Florence is like the center of the Renaissance. That was just the part I was reading yesterday, and it's like Florence was in a virtuous circle that made it kind of the center of the Renaissance for everybody's attention, because the Renaissance was quite evenly spread. The problem was in World War II, Milan and Bologna and a couple other cities were major rail hubs, so they got bombed a lot. But Florence was basically held captive by a friendly Nazi and a guy named Wolf. And there's now a plaque on the famous bridge on the Ponte Vecchio in Florence. There's a plaque thanking him for preserving the city, because when ordered to blow up the bridges, he refused. He protected the city a lot from all the bombings, and therefore a lot of the artifacts in Florence are better than. Another thing is the last of the Medicis was a woman who had no male heir, and so she gifted the Medici art trove to the city of Florence on the condition that none of the art ever be allowed to leave the city. And that condition in her bequest means a lot of stuff didn't get, sold away or snipped away or whatever else, at least less than other places. So it's fascinating. I love history. We last week had a really interesting opening of a call on gender, race, DEI, other kinds of issues. And I was hoping we would continue that conversation. And I'm hoping to feel our way into what has juice for all of you on the topic. But I framed it as, how do we make social progress? And one of the questions that came up last time is, what do we mean by social coherence? Which I think is an interesting term. Any afterthoughts on last week's conversation for those of you who have a vestige of a memory of it? And if not, where would you like to start in on this?
I appreciated it a lot. We went into territory that I haven't heard enough in other conversations. I note that last week I think we did not record, or we were not posting. And
I recorded but did not post.
And I think that's
and
a
if
question.
anybody,
That's a question for today as well.
Sounds good. So let's be mindful of that walking in, and then make a decision in the call. Other thoughts, comments, questions, or what do we mean by who was it last week who asked what do we mean by social coherence? Matthew, was it you? No.
I believe so.
I'm forgetting who it was.
And I would just note, if we're going to post this week, we should be careful about references to who said what last week, because there were some sensitivities about that.
Good point. Thank you.
Well, I was raising this in the context of social cohesion is required for common response to a crisis or to challenges, and the absence of social cohesion, so the divisions within our society at this point make it very difficult to respond to anything. And when you compare that, even in contemporary times, for example, to the Ukraine, which has a very high degree of cohesion in defending themselves, you see how powerful this can be. And then you can see how much trouble you can get into if that's not the case when you look at our own scenario here.
Thanks, Klaus. There's a thought in my brain that I added. November of 2020, I will paste it into the chat. And America is bitterly split. It will be hard to heal. And that's just America. Scott, please.
All right, so last time I don't know, I raised some things that no one really responded to, which was completely fine. And I have had a conversation with another one of the members here who is not actually here at the moment, but he's been on calls before. And we were talking about discriminations. And one of the things we were landing on, just the two of us, was what are unimportant discriminations? Are there any? Because we seem to discriminate which discriminations we're going to pay attention to. I'll give you an example. Height. You know what? Shorter people make less money. We know this because taller people make more money. But I don't hear any commentary about what we're going to do about this to make it more equitable for the shorter people in the world. And what Klaus just said kind of tied into this for me. I think it was a very interesting thing. Klaus, you often trigger interesting thoughts in my head. So social coherence required for common responses to challenges. Okay, that seems like a really interesting idea. Am I supposed to respond based on my race, based on my sex, based on my age, based on my height, based on the number of books I've read, based on the number of books I haven't read, my shoe size? And when you realize that individuals are unique and a collection of all these attributes, each one of us a unique intersection, a Venn diagram, if you will, of all these different attributes. How are you supposed to respond when you're being asked to respond as a man, as a 60-year-old, as a whatever? And so this whole social coherence, it's like, well, that's really interesting. So, or do I respond as myself? Which was my point last week, which was that we are all effectively individuals, and I prefer to treat people that way. So that's just my provoker for the moment. That's kind of where my head's at. I'm done.
Thank you. Pete.
Thanks, Scott. Some of what you said made me think about it. It seemed like you had kind of a neutral and generalist perspective of society, or how I'm supposed to react to, or you're supposed to react to. I kind of wanted to point out that, take height, for instance, or eye color is a little bit less. Height is a good thought experiment. One of the things that our societies do strongly is we have a thing called the golden rule. Them that have the gold make the rules. So we have winners. So, take tall people or short people or something like that. Over time, we have forces in our society which align, quote unquote, society in general to the winners. So it's kind of a winner thing, right? The tall people say, well, I kind of think tall people should be more in control and should make more money. And as that grows, they win, basically. Same thing with men, same thing with people with a lot of money, and especially in a capitalist system. So we don't have a generalized society. And I think this happens in a lot of ways that we don't even really think about it. The really obvious ones are gender or race or capital. But I think it happens in lots of other ways too. And it significantly warps the whole discussion, right? Social coherence to what? Well, social coherence to the society that the winners decided you should have social coherence to, not something that we kind of all decided together in plenary.
Thanks, Pete. Um, Part of the question, I think, is who is represented in whatever question is coming up around governance. And I'm reminded again of this book, Inventing the Renaissance, where Palmer talks about il popolo, which means the people. And it's really easy to think the people means all the people. And the people actually only means about 10% of the people. In fact, intentionally, it kind of lops off the very, very, very top, the dukes or the royalty, and then it's men who have businesses basically are il popolo, the people, and those are the only people who were chosen into government. And in the city of, and every city had a different structure, but in the city of Florence, they had sortition, which means you get randomly selected into the government. They picked 9 people every 2 months, and they were so worried about corruption that they locked these people up in the tower for those 2 months. So when you were in charge, which was for just 2 months, you and those other 8 people were locked together to make decisions. And then the next crew of 9 would come in, and of course you can imagine it's really hard to make decisions over long periods of time because the administration is changing every little bit. But they thought this was a hard to corrupt system until it wasn't, until Cosimo de' Medici sort of figured out how to kind of run the table by giving away most of his money in civic. So another reason Florence benefits a lot is that virtue in Florence is kind of like a potlatch. He who gives away most of his fortune in public goods has the most power. Yet at the end of the day, maybe less money than most everybody else. All the dynamics are really, really interesting. Anyway, all of that to say that very, very often the people making decisions aren't at all the people affected by those decisions. And that's one of the issues, Scott, I think when you're pointing out, can't we just treat people as people? I think last week I also raised Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, in which caste is a way that humans pick some arbitrary thing, height, eye color, nose width, skin color often, and then decide to make large social distinctions based on those attributes, which are artificially wrought on society in order to create distinction and power and so forth. So it tends to be a lot about power struggles. Go ahead, Scott.
Just a quick comment on that. I had heard something in a podcast this week about how evolutionarily, this was someone's opinion, that evolutionarily it made sense to make a quick distinction between the person advancing towards you across the savannah. And that had a benefit at a certain point to know if this was part of your group or not part of your group. But that in our current situation, that genetic, or I guess, component that's part of us doesn't serve us well, because that isn't really the case anymore. So anyway, it's that's just an unformed thought, but it tied to, I think, what you were trying to say.
Thanks, Scott. Klaus.
Yeah, but this reminds me of my last job. I was a global head of target group marketing for a German-based company, and so I had teams in 30 countries, and I would go out and do what we call country audits. Um, so I would pretty regularly spend like 1 week in a country. It could be China, India, Russia, and I would do visits to the wholesale markets because my team was identifying market segments and then how do they function and how did we have to adjust our products and services and price ranges and so on, pack sizes, to meet specific market segments. And so it was amazing to see what quirks each country had. So India, for example, I mean, there was just like our German accounting team just didn't know what to do with these guys because you would go to the wholesale market and the entire accounting system was a little flip chart where the guy kept track of who owes him what, complete chaos. But it worked. I mean, there was a communion within them and a completely trust-based economy. Then you went to Russia, and that was the most bizarre wholesale market because you couldn't trust anybody. And anything was just based on power. Anybody, I mean, anyone in power could come in and mess you up, and make decisions that would disrupt the entire flow. So and then France, for example, was very trust-based as well. You just and very local in their way of functioning. So you could tell, and I never thought of it this way, obviously, but you could tell a level of cohesion in each country that was really determining the entire economy, the economic flows, the way that people were doing their accounting, the way people extended credit and just knew that this would get paid back in time, and so there is like a spirit, and this is a persona, right? I would call it a persona that emerges where you can do a certain generalization. I mean, we would adjust our approach to doing business in a country based on identifying this is how they do business, right? In Romania or in Czechia or Poland and so on. Spain was very unique. Spain was also very trust-based uh, economy where I mean the supply, the wholesaler would just bring product to the restaurant and to the catering based on what he knew this guy would want. There was no check it out and order and prove and verify. It just happened. So there is a whole lot more to it. And we have in the US, the entire exchange has become very stylized. You can put the comma into the wrong place in your contract, and all of a sudden you find yourself losing money or getting sued, or having your relationship disrupted. Uh, so there is so I think what I'm suggesting is that social cohesion, when you look at it at a meta level, has a persona, and we are interacting, like personas are interacting.
Thanks, Klaus. Um, I'm wondering how to make this topic more personal and less sort of abstract, ethereal. Um, we can salonify about it a while, but I'm interested in our sort of experiences of social change, social cohesion, and how societies go about fixing problems they perceive, because we seem to be doing that wrong often. I think that was my broader question for the call last week. Was like, hey, uh, DEI was a response against racial inequities and gender inequities and so forth going on. The responses that got institutionalized seemed to not work, but B, cause insane backlash. And what might we do better? And that led, I think, to the question of social cohesion. Like, well, what does it mean to do that? And then I have other questions about, hey, who do you agree with? How do we agree with each other? And what degree of confidence do we attribute to that? And Klaus, when you were talking about how in France there was high trust, also in societies with less mobility, and I don't mean that people couldn't move away, but that people loved where they lived and were citizens of that place and could trace themselves back a couple generations. Your reputation is on the line, so you're trustworthy partly because you want to be involved with those people in the future, and that helps. One of modernity's problems is that its exit is easy because we're very mobile people, and that makes trust building hard just by the ease of switching, the ease of leaving. Um, so I'm wondering, yeah, Matthew.
It does look like now if I raise my hand, I can get a hand raise icon. But
Cool.
give me 1 second. We got a cat who's asking to be let out.
All right, gonna let the cat out of the
So
bag.
let the cat out of the room. Yeah. I mean, there's a one thing that bubbles for me has to do with this. I don't know if it's a distinction between social cohesion and coherence, but I'm thinking about in small groups, people working on a project together. I've certainly had the experience of, okay, things are humming. We bring one new person in, and all of a sudden, you know, these two people over here are fighting now, right? Or somebody leaves, and these folks are having issues. And the weird ways in which there's such um that system. My perception is anytime we try something new, it's awkward. It's an awkward dance at first, and it takes a while before that system is able. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen, but it has a capacity to sort of find a way to be in grace with one another and the surrounding context and all of that. And uh, so some of that is bubbling for me a little bit. And then on the cohesion at a little bit larger scale, um, it feels like there's some stuff around either, hey, this is a pretty like we're all kind of pointed in the same direction. We've been living in the same village a real long time. We've all got the same religious beliefs, etc. A friend of mine had mentioned years ago, after having done Peace Corps in Africa for 3 years, that it was much easier for people to date in the small villages that she had lived in Africa than it was, coming back
Yeah.
to the United States, where like good luck finding somebody who shares your values, because the value range is really diverse. Um, and so there's that sort of thing, but then there's also the other context where it's like, well, there's a lot of people with different beliefs here, but we all are kind of okay with live and let live, and those feel like different versions of how you can get to a community functioning. Um, but I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you. Thank you. Scott, please.
Matthew, that was very interesting. Have you heard of it's from combinatorial mathematics. It's the way to calculate the number of relationships between any given number of people. It's a formula n times n minus 1 divided by 2. And what it means is that you get like 6 people. So that's n, that's 6 times n minus 1 is 5. That's 30 divided by 2 is 15. So 6 people have 15 different things. And the more people, like you said, you get a new person in there and you think, oh, it's just a new person. And I was like, no, it's not just a new person. It actually, they have an interaction with every other person, and it creates this ripple through the system, which is why the most complex thing you'll ever interact with is a group of people. It's beyond our capacity in some levels. So Pete, I think it was Pete. No, who was talking about it? Yes, you were talking about transactional world. I think it was Pete. Maybe it was, I lose track. Anyway, it reminded me of the story that I have to relate again, but I realized that this transactional world, everyone's replaceable in a transactional world because they're just an ATM machine, right? Like you go up and you do this thing. And it kind of makes us self-centered, and it also makes us realize that even though whether we admit it or not, that we aren't essential, that we're replaceable. Because in a transactional world, I can take my widget out and put somebody else's widget in, and no one will know any different. So the quick story I have to say, relate. This was one of the big 10, I think, in my life. And it happened in the last 10 years. I was at a drive-through, restaurant drive-through. And I pulled up and I'm in a low car and the window was kind of high. And I end up putting I had my card in my hand, put my card out, and a hand took it. And then a hand comes down and hands me my card back. And then another hand, comes down and hands me my bag of, eats. And I grab it and I set it on the seat and I start to pull away. And I realized in that moment, I didn't know if they were old, young, tall, short, man, woman, black, white, but I had no concept of this individual. It was the most purely transactional experience I've ever had. And I hated it. I hated myself for it. I said, I will never treat another person like that again. And I think that we as a society have moved in that direction. Not the direction I realized, but moved into that transactional direction. And I went with it. And I made a point of saying I'll never do that again. And I wonder how that relates to this idea of social cohesion, right?
Scott, I love that story. You reminded me at the start of what you're talking about a sociology text I read long ago that I have not been able to find again, which was about when you move to a new neighborhood in a country. And I wish I remembered which country this was. But the custom is that other people will come and give you a gift. In Germany, that's usually like bread and salt in the good old days, because those are the things you kind of need to start a household. So that was a common gift. Um, but in this particular place, the custom then was to reciprocate and not to reciprocate in an equal fashion. Because if you gave them something of equal worth, that meant you were done with them. You had no more bind between them. So you should reciprocate with something a little more valuable or a little less valuable than the thing they started the dance with, so that there was always a tie between you, always a little bit of unevenness in social obligation, debt, whatever you want to call it. I don't know. There's lots of interesting ways to do this, but that was just the norm of the practice. And if you didn't know about this and gave them back roughly the same thing, you were kind of insulting them, right, by implication, which is really interesting. So fold into this social norms across different communities around the world, high trust, low trust cultures, cultures where you trust family linkages before everything else, cultures where something else happens. It's all humans are funny. Mike.
I'm sorry to be joining late. At least this time I'll theoretically be able to stay to the end. Incredibly important topic and one that I've thought a lot about but not figured out. I've been very lucky in my life to have been part of communities that have had a lot of social coherence. In the past, I've talked about my experiences growing up in a Lutheran church, and the experience I have now is being part of an Episcopal church. And I'm not a leader by any means in that church, but I very much feel that this is a group of people that I could call up and would help bail me out of jail, or get me to the hospital, or whatever might come up, and not one or two people out of 500 members of the church, but 100. And it's a particularly heterogeneous church, the one I belong to now, which makes it all the more interesting to see how all these tight bonds have been formed. In the past, I've talked a lot about transparency, which I think is a critical ingredient to building the trust that makes coherence possible. But another thing that we don't talk about very much that causes coherence is external challenge. There's always this talk about how we could get rid of partisan fights if we just had a alien species land on the planet and threaten everything we believe in. Another example for me was when I was an undergraduate at Caltech. Incredibly tight, trusted community of about 850 undergraduates. That's 850 at the start of the year. By the end, it was typically 800 because 50 of these students had gotten admitted to Stanford or Berkeley, or had gone to their home state university and were having a much better time. The intense pressure on students, even in your freshman year when you were on a pass-fail system, really brought people together. There was never any of this cutthroat behavior that you saw at other campuses, because everybody was in it together. you work together on problem sets, and that was not only allowed, that was encouraged. There certainly is something to be said for fighting against a common force. I won't say a common enemy, but common pressure makes people pull together. I don't know what that diagnosis says about what prescription we need for our current society, but we're not getting there. We're not realizing that there are all these things that are common threats that could be used to mobilize common systems and create more coherence. So I'm rambling, but the one thing that I think is an action we could take, a prescription that would lead to more coherence, is more transparency. I am a Brinnian. I love what David Brin wrote in his book, The Transparent Society, more than 25 years ago, because it really did focus on how, from little small towns to global internet communities, when people overshare, there tends to be a sense of people reaching out to help each other. When people overshare and mention the problems they're having, they sometimes get prayers, sometimes get condolences, but almost always get some useful advice from other people who have been through similar things or have a relative who has. And I look at this group and I've seen this is another one of my groups that have a lot of coherence and a lot of love and sharing. And I want to thank you all for that. If I can ask one question, and this is the other thing that I do in this group, I am trying to find a way to reach the vlog brothers, John Green and Hank Green.
My heroes.
They are my heroes too, but I don't have a way to get past their agents and their screeners and all the rest. So I'm hoping that maybe somebody here knows somebody. Um, if you haven't watched the Vlogbrother videos, they really did launch. In many ways, they were the best example of the best things that could be provided by short form video. And they launched 1 million TikTokers, and many of them were doing very positive things about science and the future and society that have made a difference, including for my daughter, who was 14 at the time she introduced me to them. She's now 28, so and is a very curious person because of the Vlog Brothers and Jerry and other cool people. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike. Lizzie taught us about nerdfighteria, which is not fighting nerds. It's nerds fighting world suck. And the nerdfighteria gang sign is this. So we have a nice picture of the Rex group, including Mike, who is an advisor, a mentor to the Rex group, doing the nerdfighteria gang sign. Thank you for that. I'm reminded also that there are lots of interesting subgroups in plain sight. Jeep owners tend to sort of honk at each other. If you've ridden a motorcycle, motorcyclists will drop a hand and wave as they cross, usually in suburban, rural settings, not so much in inner city driving. But if you're out on the road and you see a biker, you'll just say hi. The first thing that made me interested in riding was a friend taking me out to the Danbury Dairy, the Marcus Dairy in Danbury, Connecticut, where bikers from like 3 or 4 states would show up on Sunday mornings, and in their chaps would walk around with coffee and a donut and just chat and admire the bikes that were lined up by almost by make and model in this huge parking lot. And it was a tight community. But then I'm also reminded of service staff. And if you make eye contact with people who are fixing things or restocking things or bagging things or whatever, and you just say, basically, it just takes a little nod to say hi, to recognize them. That they have their own communication networks all the time, and they're seeing each other because they know what they do and how important they are. But I think they also know how generally invisible they are to privileged people in the population. And so just making contact and saying, hey, I've had a couple jobs that were just like that, and how you doing, kind of thing. Anyway, Klaus.
Yeah, this is seriously dexterity, Jerry. That was impressive. How you could move your fingers there. I went to a tech
It,
meeting
it,
yesterday.
it's the
Oh,
Star Wars
wow,
style.
look at this. Yeah, that takes practice. Um, I went to a tech meeting yesterday, and it was amazing to see how many of these guys had lost their jobs just recently. And some pretty, I mean, more senior level, director level guys, um, department leaders, and so on. And they had like no idea what next because the uh, the entire industry is in such upheaval, and the change is massive, you know, and so they're all trying to get into AI, figure out, you know, how that works and what it is and how to use it and so on. And so what struck me was the complete lack of support systems here. And that's another one, when you look at meta level coherence. Um, when I was going back to Germany for 5 years, in whatever, 2008 or so, um, there were some labor fights. You know, the automobile industry had some serious disruptions, and the conversations were much more nurturing in the sense of how can we help, how can we avoid, you know, these massive layoffs, because the German labor force is not mobile. They have their house and that's where they live. And if their husband needs, or if, you know, the breadwinner needs to find another job, they typically travel. It's like my boss flew in from Spain every week. You know, I mean, literally would go home every weekend to Madrid, flying back and forth, because he wouldn't want to upset his family and the kids in school and so on. So, but I remember one conversation that really struck me because there was a labor protest, and Angela Merkel at the time was in conversation with these union members, and they were yelling out, "Don't sell us out, Angela! You know, you got to help us here," and so on. And so the relationship was so personalized, that no, we can't let these guys go down. And we have now reached, I mean, and which has never happened in the US in the first place. I mean, here you just have no protection. You know, it's just um, you can just, you know, close down a whole factory or department or whatever, and it just happens. And those are important parts for a society because it creates so much anxiety, right? If you don't have uh, a feeling that there are supporting structures in place, uh, and it creates this, you know, highly competitive spirit. So maybe that's good in some sense because the economy, you know, advances faster and does, and maybe it's creative in some ways, I don't know, but it sure makes life really hard. So I felt, you know, a lot of empathy yesterday in the room, for these guys trying to continue their paying their bills and maintaining their family, and struggling to what am I going to do next here? And so the economic realities of our time, not that they have ever really been different, I guess, but uh, uh, really make it really have a good tendency to rip us apart further. Uh,
Mhm.
and I don't see any kind of attempt to really to change that and bring a sense of humanity and empathy, you know, into our economic process. And I think that's the baseline of what you need for, you know, social coherence and yeah.
Thanks, Klaus. I'm reading and collecting a whole mess of opinions on both extreme sides of AI is going to bring about the great unemployment and AI is going to create more jobs. And people are feeling very strongly on both ends of it. And if y'all are interested, that would make a good OGM topic at some point, just to compare notes on what that is. But I'm ginger about heading into AI topics with us as a group too often, but that might make a really good one. Scott.
I hope Mike, oh, good. Mike's still here. Um, so yeah, I've heard that whole all we need is a good alien invasion to pull everybody together idea. And it
We had a
occurred to
pandemic and that didn't
that's
work.
exactly what I was going to say is that so COVID was a test of the common enemy idea, but
Yep.
it didn't create the predicted cohesion, which I think is really, I mean, that's basically the biggest experiment we could have ever had. It reached everywhere. Um, so I was reminded of a story I heard on NPR years ago. I still haven't found the source. I don't know who it was about, but I remembered the story very clearly. It was about it's an interview with the oldest congressman at the time. He was in his 80s. And it was a reflection on on how things had changed over his tenure. And he said, well, it used to be that we were all this, take this for what it's worth. We were all a bunch of World War II buddies who had fought together and they'd come back to the country to rebuild. So we all had a common goal, even though we disagreed with each other about fundamental things. We had this common goal, which was to try to rebuild. And we had fought together. We had developed these bonds um, over that. And now it was a bunch of individuals who are trying to stay in office, and they'd lost that common thing. And I thought that was interesting. And as a result of that, later on in my hockey league, my adult recreational hockey league, there's always the people who are fighting with each other. And during the Christmas holiday, I think it was, lots of people went away. So we had a sparse group of people. And I suggested we have the Goodwill game. So called it the Goodwill game. And basically it was whoever was left. Didn't matter what team you were on. We're all going to show up. We're going to throw our sticks in a pile, and you separate the sticks. You go find your stick, and now you're on that team. And what happened was people played with people who weren't on their team. These were people that they were out there like this the week before. But now you're on the bench next to me, and we're fighting the same fight out here, in adult recreational hockey. But what happened is there was always a period of a couple months after that where the scrappiness went away, because now that the person that you're facing off with, you just played with them a couple weeks ago, and it changed the dynamic, and it was very interesting. So I thought I'll bring those up. I love this idea of small groups kind of
Mhm.
spontaneously being made, especially by choice, not by things that are not under your control.
Thanks, Scott. There have been multiple efforts to get somewhere with Israeli-Palestinian peace that would take people to, in one case, Guatemala, I think, somewhere in Central America, and they were all building homes together for other people. And it turned out that these groups achieved high cohesion. They really liked each other, and then went back to their homes and well, situation there is not a lot better at this point. Um, and I want to draw our attention to the COVID question, which I think we all have personal experience of. But as an example of this notion of mandates versus cohesion, I think one of the reasons that the common enemy of a tiny virus we couldn't see with our naked eye, not causing us all to form, in unison, was the mandates that came down. And I think the whole how countries and people and cities reacted to the pandemic, some of which was cultural. We all know that in Japan and other parts of Asia, wearing a mask was normal anyway before the pandemic, that if you had a cold, it was polite to just mask yourself, or if you were traveling on public transport, you just didn't want to catch everybody's germs. It was a normal thing in society. But also, if anybody read, I buried a link in the invite for today's call. I buried a link to a conversation I had with Claude trying to analyze a bit of this about why people reject mandates and how to create something that's more voluntary. I'll put a link to it in the chat here, but it was super interesting to me. And people really don't like being told what to do. Even when we think it's good for them, they hate it. And there's likely a few things that we have to mandate, but I don't know exactly what those are anymore. Louise, thank you for your patience. There you go.
been really wonderful to listen to the conversation. I'm going to start with the way Klaus introduced his experience, and it's lovely to hear that it's from a personal experience, that different countries, different societies have different characters, different personalities. I'm living in France, but come from the UK, obviously. And that's been a very personal experience as well. This country that I've joined, France, has a very definite character and personality that's different from the one that I had in the UK. So the positives are there is a strong social system here in France, as in Germany. You know, they take care of their people. That even falls into small regions. The French regions are very, I'm going to use the word patriotic because it's a word that suggests they're very proud and they greatly support their communities and the things that come out of the communities, the peoples, the products, etc. That's very positive. I don't visit Germany very often, but I would say when I do, there's a real sense that it's a successful country. You might measure that by how clean, smart, wealthy towns appear. But that is very clear. It feels very successful and very safe. I'm sure it's not all like that, but that's generally my impression when I visit Germany. I visit Holland, I visit Spain. They all seem to have, you know, good sort of character, good character. However, for me, social cohesion sounds too much like coercion for me, and that is where I come from. And that it has to be, you know, they have to be very careful that groups, societies don't fall into that coercion. Somebody was talking about the winners deciding. I think that's where the coercion might come from. You've got groups of people who hold power, who determine what that society is going to look like. And some people, of course, are coerced into those groups, coerced into behaviours. They might not be healthy for themselves. So then I was reflecting on Scott's idea of, I think it was Scott with the combinatorics, and I know the formula, I teach maths. So that idea of how many connections you have. Because one thing I see in France is that socially, it's considered good practice to belong to associations, but not just one, numerous associations. And I think, again, it was Scott talking about working with one group of people here and then another group of people there. And then you meet people that you might be in conflict in one area, but you worked with them in another. So this idea in France that you want to be a member of a number of different associations, bringing you together with different groups of people to work in collaboration with them. That might often be social. It might be playing board games, but it might be something more community-based as well. The idea that a trust-based system is positive, while I'm experiencing situations where it's not. In a trust-based society, people are trusted even when they're not trustworthy. How do you sort out the person? In fact, it leaves those who aren't trustworthy almost free rein to go and behave inappropriately because they're trusted, even though they're not. It also brings transparency, also brings up an issue for me, because if you're transparent, somebody else who isn't, or somebody else who wants to gain power, manipulate, if you're very transparent, that gives them the power. And again, it comes out of my background of coercion. It gives them a power over you if you're over transparent. So actually being guarded, even in a trusting society. So I don't think I've answered any questions, but that's my experiences and my apprehension about forming this cohesion in society. That's my.
Thank you. There's a certain vulnerability to being transparent. And I think that the role of vulnerability in all of this is really, really, really interesting. My favorite saying on this is probably from Brene Brown, which is that vulnerability is the path to authentic connection and joy. I love that saying because I think she just nails it. That when you show up as less than perfect, when you show up and sort of uh, have an opening, I think that leads to better relationships. And the problem is that people who decide not to do that, as I was just typing into the chat, like if you reject that piece of the social contract, then you're different. You're maybe at an advantage because other people have shown you their weaknesses or whatever, but you're not going to build trust. Louise, if you want to jump back in, go ahead.
Well, I come from a position of coercion. If you're open, if you're vulnerable, if you're genuine, and all somebody wants to do is exploit and coerce you, and you don't recognize that, then you've just opened. So I'm not sure it's a route to always a really fabulous, lovely, delightful relationship if the person opposite you isn't genuine. And then when and how do you find that out? Only at a big disaster at the end of it. So I actually, or from my own personal experience, being genuine, vulnerable, and open has not served me well. So
Yeah.
it's not my
And
personal experience that it's the route to great relationships, not at all.
I know. And you're making me realize that it's imagine a world in which it was mandatory to be vulnerable, right? And some communities wind up going that way, where gosh, you didn't do that, so you're a bad person, and you almost force people to do that. Then it loses its value, it loses it shifts the whole thing entirely. So I think this is an open door to more interesting conversations about this topic. Gil, please.
Yeah, thank you. Wonderful call. Louise, thank you so much for all that. You didn't answer questions, but you raised some wonderful ones. So thank you. I appreciate the provocation. I was really um, um, a couple stuck with me particularly. One is the picture of France with the multiple associations. It's taking the networks that Scott and Pete were giving us the mathematics for before and shuffling them or interweaving them. So there's another layer of multiple associations of people, which I think does something to enrich tolerance and understanding, I think. Um, Iceland may be an example of that. I was really startled by what you said about coherence and cohesion. I'm sorry, cohesion and coercion. Um, and I understand it, but it was a surprising thought for me. But I don't think that's the only axis that's at play here, because we also have care and courtesy. We also have coherence, which is maybe different than cohesion. This is all about how do we get along? How do we live in a world of difference? And which differences make what kind of difference? And part of the mess here, Jerry, from the topic that we're raising is that people, uh, and Scott, you talked about this with the physical characteristics, people are assigning different degrees of importance to different kinds of difference. And we differ about those. And it's a mess and it's complicated. But And it's complicated in part by the world of social media that we're in part by the political weaponization of all this stuff. I suspect that there have been other epidemics in the world before, but none of them in the grips of MAGA, Trump, and an anti-vax movement, which actively intervened in the forming medical perspective about this. And the completely understandable feature of, we're learning as we go. We don't know exactly what this vaccine is doing. Our protocols are changing as we learn. That got characterized as lying, as opposed to being characterized as science and an evolving strategy in the face of an evolving disease. And that was, an intentional political strategy. And so that complicates the story. If we face the alien invasion in this America rather than the America of the 50s, it's a really different story. So I'm done. And I'm sorry, I'm going to have to leave in a few minutes for another call. I'm sorry to leave early. It's so juicy.
No worries. Thanks, Gil. Scott.
Luis, lovely stuff. I appreciate your perspective on that, on trust. Two things about that. One of my favorite bosses she was so interesting on that. She always said trust but verify. And
Hmm.
she would say that all the time. And I took it to heart because I prefer to trust and get burned than to walk around distrusting all the time. And I understand that if you had an experience where that's all you've always been burned, how many times are you going to put your hand on the stove, right? Like you're gonna, it just makes it so difficult to do. And maybe well, that's probably a certain privilege I have by having never been seriously burned. Um, so the second thing, though, I thought that you started off with this idea that these regions, these countries have personalities, and that was an extension of someone else's idea. And I I played Dungeons and Dragons with a group of people, and I have for like 5 years. And we just had one of the guy's partners, she joined up with the group. And I found out that when she creates her dungeon worlds as a dungeon master for her own little groups, she she creates these settlements with characteristics. So normally in this world, you create your character. You're you're a knight, you're a wizard, you're the whatever you happen to be. And they have attributes and characteristics, I think was the term that you used. And so she applies physical, emotional, mental, mystical to the settlement as she's creating it. And I thought it was kind of fascinating. For example, one of them was this particular settlement has +2 emotional. What this means is that there's a lot of ritual outpourings of emotions. The temples tend to scream and cry, and there's a lot of, they're entrenched in catharsis. There's not much privacy of emotion. And I thought it was just an interesting way I hadn't really heard people describe, oh, well, a country has characteristics, and it made me think of it's an entity that's a summation of all the individuals. Okay, thank
Hmm. Thanks, Scott. Pete.
Since it came up, I wanted to reflect a little bit on COVID and coherence. And I know a few of us here, including me, still mask in public. And I'm grateful to the public that most people don't reject that, at least where I live. So I really wanted to underline what Gil said, that social cohesion in the U.S. At least was significantly attacked and decimated by political forces. I think some of that was for the purpose of power. If you say something strongly, even if it's maybe wrong, and people like it, they go, oh wow, that person is strong, and I want to believe that, whatever. So some of it was just in aggregating political power. I think a significant part of it was also, and it was a good example, I think, of forces exterior to the U.S. And this happens in every country, and the U.S., the U.S. kind of in general does it to other countries. So I'm not saying that we're special and that it happens to us and that we don't do it to other people, but especially in the last, 20 years or something like that, the U.S. is significantly under attack from foreign actors, and has a really hard time understanding that. We as a people, we don't really understand why we're so divided. We like being divided, or we think we like being divided, but a lot of it is just manipulation. So, whoever external forces were watching, the social trends, I'm sure they just turned up the volume on, yes, anti-vax. Yes, mandates are terrible. Yes, I can't believe these people are forcing their will on you. You'll have to wear a mask and you'll die from, suffocating or whatever. It was a big thing. And I don't bring it up because I want to relitigate that. I want to bring it up because it's still happening all the time. And we have this picture that the US and in any country, but the US is this, careful society where we're all democratic and we all vote and we have a consensus opinion of what's going on. we live in that as kind of a fantasy at this point, where the larger proportion of what we decide as a culture is what other people manipulating the culture have decided that we should decide as a culture. Also, I wanted a real quick observation, which is minor compared to that, I think, but still really interesting. A big chunk of the COVID confusion was in 2020. In 2020, very early, within April and May, there were people who understood that there was transmission was not just by droplets, it was also
Aerosol.
by aerosols. And that was canonical science for a minority of the scientific community, and anti-canonical science for the majority of the scientific community. So the people who actually knew the truth were saying the truth, and they were building uh, air filters and things like that in April and May even. It took a litigation of that and a nasty fight amongst the largest scientific community for the rest of science to drop what had become canon for them, that you could only transmit disease through droplets. That took until October, November, something like that, to kind of get through it. And that was kind of too late for us to really take masking and air quality and filtering seriously. And that was another lost opportunity. Not as great as the lost opportunity of resisting the exterior forces that just made us decohere, but it was still there too.
Thanks, Pete. And the the whole pandemic reaction is just, I think, will be studied for decades, because I haven't seen good and sort of retrospective analyses recently. I wish I did, because I think that was a monster case study in power dynamics and a bunch of other things as well. So would love to see that. Matthew.
Yeah, this is a little bit of a callback to some of the earlier comments, but reflecting on some of the relational graph, mathematical explosion, n times n minus 1, that kind of stuff. A number of years ago, I was visiting my friend Nora Bateson in Sweden, and I'd never been there before. And very quickly, I realized, wow, this place is very different from any place I've been before. And I'd been to a lot of places, And it took me a few days to kind of try to put my finger on it, but I had this realization that, oh, wow, if you do socialism really well, you generate a libertarian culture. And in some ways, this is the two sides of the same coin, right? We are all one nation. If you need a job, go talk to the government. You need education, go talk to the government. You need healthcare, go talk to the government. My neighbor doesn't need to show up for me. There won't be consequences if my neighbor doesn't show up for me. So peer pressure to show up starts to go away. And I had a little bit of a recognition that what you end up with in either of those instances, where you have like the individual is the unit to pay attention to, or we are all one, that's we're all individually in relationship with the whole, as opposed to there being lots of layers of relationship, like the multiple memberships of associations and those kinds of things that got spoken to earlier. And the pieces that bubbled for me in response to that were like, okay, I have this belief that just like muscle development and things like that, social coherence tends to get stronger or aligned in particular ways in response to stress or difficulty, right? There's a disaster, we come together and address the disaster. Same with the comments about the politician who had been at war with a bunch of buddies, and they all came back sort of with some different kind of alignment than a later generation might have had. But those things tend to be in relation. They tend to develop in some dimension that's related to the kinds of stress that they experience. But the other thing that bubbles for me here has to do with this is kind of closer to the relational graph or social network stuff. Like you can't actually do a Newtonian view of groups. Like you don't get there is no real 30,000 foot view of the boundary of a group. That can be a useful shorthand for trying to map something. These folks are inside the group, those folks are outside the group. But the reality is the membranes of the group are always being generated and enforced by the participants themselves, and not uniformly, right? And so if one person is perceiving like what that person did is not acceptable, or that person is on the outside of the boundary, not the inside, um, and these things are like constantly in subtle flux. Not that there aren't attempts to influence that and kind of enforce some particular line, whether that's a physical border or hey, the bathroom is for employees only, right? Like that might be technically the rule, but if the cute boy walks in and the girl behind the counter um, hands him the keys to the restroom when he asks if he can use the restroom, then the bathroom is for employees and cute boys only, like in practice, right? And there may be repercussions. She might get a slap on the wrist or fired or something else, right? And then you have other people being more likely to comply. But it's a much messier thing. And so that rich dimensionality of how I perceive us to be in relationship and how you perceive us to be in relationship and what we consider our community and what the norms are, all of that is much more complicated than this is the number of folks. And trying to squash that into one um, uniform landscape as opposed to the rich topology of differentiation about who I'm willing to share with and under what conditions, et cetera, feels like it loses a lot. And I'll pass it along.
Matthew, thank you. We've said a lot of words so far in this call. Why don't we go into silence for a little moment? I'll bring us back out and we can just reflect on what's been said. Thank you. Two quick points before I go to Louise and the rest of the queue. One, I think MAGA feels to me like one of the things MAGA is anxious about and has nostalgia about is how we used to take care of one another in towns. And we used to like, hey, go check in on Mrs. Smith because she's elderly and it snowed, and let's maybe clear her driveway and make sure she has groceries. And when you develop large social systems that are supposed to take care of elderly people, poor people, whatever else, what you do is exactly, Matthew, what you were describing. You disconnect us from one another and you remove that sense of responsibility and interdependence, which I think is the fabric of society. We use the metaphor of fabric of society because all these little interdependencies are the warp and the woof of how we live in society. And so you can have extremely successful social systems that are also kind of alienating and distancing. And I think that's a huge conundrum in how society even runs. And then, sorry, I typed something else in the chat that I was going to bring up. Oh, so I'm done. Louise, please.
Well, you've just left me with a conundrum because
Oh, no.
I was going to take Matthew's point about the strong social systems. They're here in France. I went looking for voluntary roles. I went looking for charities, and they don't really exist here in France. Why? Well, because there are strong social systems, housing, health, education, food, old age, it's all provided for. So France doesn't need charities, France doesn't need soup kitchens. But then I also realized it meant that you can't find a sense of a value, virtue by joining a charitable organization and doing good work. We don't have that here in France. I didn't find any voluntary roles. So then, Jerry, you were saying that that might mean that somehow the society is no longer so connected because you don't need to go and check in on the old person. They're cared for. You don't need to worry about somebody who's unemployed. They've got chômage, unemployment benefits. But that hasn't happened here in France, I don't think. They still have small villages have festivals and they have pride in locally produced produce. They want to go and purchase that, not something shipped from another country. So I can see how it could happen, but I don't think it's happened here. But I'm not sure. I will keep my eye on it and see if perhaps there isn't such a social cohesion because so much is taken care of by government. I don't know.
Thank you, Louise. I guess the other way of looking at it is when you take existential questions off the table, you open the space for other forms of connection that might be more entertaining, more whatever. So I love I think we should all pay attention to that. Sounds great. Klaus.
Yeah, Matthew triggered a memory in me where I was in a immersion language course in Scotland, studying English, and we had some 15 nationalities in there, people from Asia and from all over the world, really. And we had one lesson that was dealing with what do you call it, prototypes, not with now, what does it mean? I've just dropped the word. Um,
Pilots?
no, dealing with personas. They're dealing with preconceived notions about
Stereotypes?
stereotypes. So thank you.
Stereotype.
Just stopped it. Yeah, thank you. So we were going around the room talking about stereotypes of the Germans, the French, the Japanese, and it was fascinating. I mean, there was really a story that came about for each one. And then what that reminds me of is if you put it under a microscope and then zoom in and out, right? The further you zoom out, the more true becomes the stereotype. But then as you zoom in, you see differences, and you see individuals popping up, that are all unique and different. But I think that when you put stress into the system moves more towards this meta level of who we are and what we stand for, kind of thing. So there is something. I mean, there is a truism to uh, the national persona and this stereotype that is embedded that they are embedded in. But it needs to be seen in differentiated ways, right? Zooming in and out, I think makes the point that Matthew was making, that there is a lot of differentiation, at the ground level.
Thanks, Klaus. Eve, and I can't say Eve without thinking of the movie Wall-E. So
I love that. Well, I just had to come today because I just needed this group. And boy, are you guys on fire today. Oh my gosh. I mean, lots of mic drops to, I think the things that are resonating most for me, and I wanted just to add is for some things that Matthew and Louise and Jerry said. So I'm just curious about, if you all think some of your memories that are the strongest growing up, or the memories that you still hold are from like social situations in relationship when, Jerry, you're talking about the old person that we would just help. The moment you told that story, I remember, oh yeah, I forgot this story. When I was 16, I was going over this old person's house that was 3 blocks away and we all helped him. Even though he was scary and he smelled bad. I mean, we still went. Or I
was
remember,
his name Boo?
I know.
Just kidding.
Um, so the or the memory that you have when you're at school and you help somebody who was when you were 8 years old. I'm just bringing this up because this really, I wonder how much of what we feel somatically comes from our memories when it felt good to be in relation to when we were in these social coherence, or what we were modeled, what's modeled for us that feels grounded or like home. And I just bring that up because I feel so um I'm on a ship. I'm on a little boat that's getting like thrashed. And San Francisco doesn't feel, it's feeling better, but it doesn't feel like a sense of place like it used to. Or the United States doesn't feel like a sense of place like it used to. And so I just wanted to bring that up. And to Matthew's point, I lived in Copenhagen for a whole summer once, and you nailed it. You just nailed it. And what was interesting is I was drawn to go spend a summer there because it was so different. But I could never put my finger on it as eloquently as you just did. So thank you for that. So anyway, I just want to say that I appreciate all of you. I wish I could come more often because this really is an incredible conversation. Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you, Eve. Thank you so much. We have some 10 minutes left in our conversational space. Mike?
As somebody who is the son of two half Swedish Americans and a father who was half Danish American, I really resonate with what you just said, Eve. And I've gotten to spend a lot of time in Denmark, usually 3 or 4 days at a time. But what's striking to me in both Sweden and Denmark is a recognition that everybody has value. And even in Denmark, and particularly Copenhagen, where you do have a lot of people from other parts of Europe. You'll have the Polish plumber, you'll have the um, Czech heavy metal band performer. I mean, you have all sorts of different types of people, but there is a live and let live, a sharing. Again, going back to my daughter, we had a 24-hour layover in Copenhagen on a trip to Italy, and she just fell in love with this ethos of everybody looks you in the eye. There's none of this thing that Scott described where everybody's just a transaction. It really is a recognition that everybody is a person. And you might not agree with them. You might not want to spend time with them, but there was a sense of respect for their decency. And it goes back to the first line of the Declaration of Independence. And, these truths are self-evident. We used to live that in the US, and clearly now it's all about factions and, do I want to be what in-group do I want to be part of? It's really a deterioration of that wonderful idea that we're all God's children, or if you're an atheist, we all have inalienable rights. By the way, I've just started reading Walter Isaacson's new little book, 67 pages on the greatest sentence ever written, and it digs into where these ideas came from. But thanks, I really appreciate what you said, Eve.
Thanks, Mike. I was just you caused me to ask Gemini about race relations in Copenhagen, particularly with Muslims, and I was just learning about the Parallel Society Act that talks about immigrants and so forth and hostility. And I'm wondering that even in the social democracies of Northern Europe, which some people believe to be among the best run countries on earth, there is a huge rise in the far right political parties, and there's a tremendous amount of Islamophobia and other kinds of things just perking up everywhere.
But that is partly because, I mean, I'm not defending that.
Yeah.
And in some cases, it's even weirder. It's Danes deciding they don't want Swedes to move to Denmark.
Which
But
is an old
there is a
thing.
sense that we had this society where we all respected each other, and even with 10% foreigners in the major cities, there was that sense. And then people started showing up who didn't respect us. And in some cases, that was particularly bad with the Muslim society because it was a spiral downward where the people who showed up felt they weren't being respected. They formed their own little religious community, started their own weekend schools, separated themselves in some way from this ethos of inclusion and the like. And so it has, in 10 years, it has seen a real decay. But again, my daughter 10 years ago was just so struck by Copenhagen that when she had to write her college admission essay, and the question was, where did you feel so welcome and where have you felt really comfortable? Her answer was Copenhagen. And she wrote this amazing essay, which helped her get into the school of her choice. Sorry to take you off on a weird angle.
Love that. Not a weird angle, a good one. You're reminding me that I meant to say in my comments earlier that religious communities very often take care of everybody inside them. They have means for taking care of the elderly, for feeding the hungry, for tithing, for whatever. And in a high functioning religious community of almost any type, anywhere, you'll find those dynamics. And they look outside at secular life and go, wow, those people are screwed up. Like, why can't they take care of their own? Louise.
So this idea of secular society, I've lived in the UK where there's a great deal of tolerance to other groups, other religions. Well, what you might see in the news lately might not suggest that, but the idea was tolerance. Here in France, I don't know if you appreciate, but for me, I really value the way they've structured things. They are secular. And I experienced that a lot in school because when I arrive as a teacher, I'm a teacher. I am not to bring, certainly not my religion, but not my other beliefs. That's the way it should be. And that goes for students as well. That goes for workers who are working for the state. When you arrive, you are a French citizen, nothing more. If you have a religion, then you are very free to practice that in your home, in your church, outside of that environment where you turn up as a French citizen. I mean, this also goes to you're not permitted to wear a symbol that associates you with a group. So Muslim girls have to remove their veils when they arrive in school. As a Christian, if only because I was in a Christian society when I grew up, I shouldn't wear a visible cross. You're not allowed to bring any insignia that aligns you with a group. That would include right-wing political groups. That would include a band. That would include a biking group. Now, having studied cults, I really value this because, of course, one thing a cult will do is often it might be about dress. If you think of gangs, it's about wearing colours. And I do think that that idea that the French have managed to instill in their public society is really helpful as we're talking about a coherent society. That is helpful. When you turn up in public, you turn up as a French citizen, nothing else. So it's one approach.
Thanks, Louise. It's fascinating, and you're making me think of the history of lots of different places. Like, I'm very curious about how Italy and France became nations, for example, and what that squeezed out. I was reading "Seeing Like a State," which sort of leads there. Um, Scott, please.
That's fascinating. I hadn't heard that before. I don't like to wear logo shirts because I feel it's an imposition. And I'm incredibly high in the agreeableness trait of the big five. And so I don't want to be offending anyone. And so I tend to, I don't like, who cares what I'm wearing? But I do because I think it reflects. So that's interesting that there's a culture that is kind of aligned that way. Um, Very quick Copenhagen story. I was very privileged to take my mom to Scandinavia in 2013. And our first stay was in Copenhagen. And I rented a bike from the hotel and drove around one of the, I don't know, smaller neighborhoods that was there, rode around. And I saw a little house, thought it was adorable. I took out my camera and I'm taking some pictures as I am because I'm a tourist and I'm just, being offensive and taking pictures. And a woman comes out the door and she says, and I said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." And she said, "Would you like to see the inside?" I'm just this random dude driving around, right? She took me on a tour of her house, showed me her grape garden, the whole thing. Took pictures of her. Her name was Nessie. Got her email address, emailed them to her later. And it was wonderful.
Love that. Love that. Any closing thoughts on the topic, on the call, places this takes you? Stories you're remembering?
Just to second that idea, coherence sometimes does come from a shared sense of aesthetic. And the Danish do aesthetic really well. And it's not all the same, but there is a pride in making things look beautiful. The Japanese are even better at it.
One piece bubbled for me, and it had to do with Nora's dad, Gregory Bateson, had done some work on what he coined a term schismogenesis, which was sort of how does a system break apart? Like how does a community or an ecosystem or an individual, he studied schizophrenia for part of his career, fracture. And he had identified a couple of patterns. One he called complementary schismogenesis. The other was symmetrical schismogenesis. Symmetrical is like the arms race. Hey, you get a fancy car, I need a fancy car, and we start competing, and this can get so out of hand that the relationship basically fractures, right? And the complementary schismogenesis was more like there's a differential, like parent child or student teacher, and that can be really helpful initially, but if that sort of accentuates and gets more and more reinforced, it can lead to, again, a fracturing of relationship. But there were these Finnish researchers who pointed out something decades later that was kind of more like a, an unwillingness to make myself vulnerable because I think you're not going to make yourself vulnerable. And you see me not making myself vulnerable, so you don't make yourself vulnerable. And so we end up sort of, and in anticipation of the other person not showing up, we don't show up, and we actually end up kind of driving that pattern. And some of the comments about Copenhagen, it felt like, oh, there's, yes, there's people stepping on one another's toes and cultural differences, but I'm sure there's a bunch of that other stuff kind of baked in there too. Yeah.
Thanks, Matthew.
We
Klaus, go ahead.
I'm on this project with the Schumacher Institute. It's called Future How, and one core idea in this project was to build islands of coherence. And it stems from the realization that we are so divided and there are so many difficulties to bring us together in a larger sense, that it's better to focus on building islands and then letting these islands become magnets and examples for the larger whole to be attracted to it. So we're just in a transition phase because the current project ends in June, and we are looking at where can we go with this, in moving into the fall. But I think the concept of islands of coherence. I mean, Kalia is working on this. Kevin is working on this. There's a lot of energy into making a community stronger, through local cohesion, collaboration, and I think that may be the path, forward, to create that and to have an umbrella network that provides support, and not in a sense of physical support, but exchange of best practice ideas, best practice examples, and that can enrich that creates a substrate for these communities to thrive. I think that's probably the most practical way forward for us.
I recognize that we're
Klaus.
at time, but there was one thing I realized. I shared like the parts of that pattern that drive, a breakdown. But Gregory had a little bit of an insight into ways to counter that. And one of them was when you're stuck in this symmetric pattern, like an arms race, if you can find some context in which you can flip that, so that you're now in a complementary pattern, like you're having to help take care of somebody who's in need of help. That can actually, even if it's in a different dimension, that can shift things, or vice versa. So the hockey game analogy that happened earlier with the people all of a sudden ending up reminded me of that, right? That there's a shift that can occur there that can result in a shift in that whole relational field for quite a while. So thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Matthew. Briefly, I'm curious what Isaacson says about the sentence, because I pasted the sentence in the chat. We hold these truths to be self-evident from the Declaration of Independence. And it's like that all men are created equal. To me, there was like such deep hypocrisy in that sentence when it was written, because women, slaves, everybody else, Native Americans did not count as people. And I'm like, wow, that just, it sort of rocks my world how long it's taken us to realize that that was not a thing they actually meant, or that they meant it differently, or I don't know what. And then I'm also noting that certain unalienable rights goes a little bit toward our thread here about mandates, where it's like, hey, these things are inalienable. They're just a given. They're inseparable from people. Therefore, we mandate that everybody has these things. And then they're vague: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Oh my God, you could go all different directions with what that means. If you have an unalienable right to life, not entirely sure what that means. Liberty, wow, that's a weaponized term these days. And happiness, whose? Like the collective happiness? Is it okay? Like, do we all suffer a little bit so that we're all really? So this is, to me, it's an incredibly complex sentence. I've not read the book, I've heard of it, but I'm curious like how he deals with the crazy complexities that the sentence engenders.
I'll report
Gil,
back.
please do, Mike. Thanks.
Jerry, could I just add a thought on that? I realize we're over.
Yes.
I've been out on another call, but hopping back in. It's flawed for sure, and hypocritical for sure. And Tad Stormer, who's a professor at the University of Southern Denmark, a scholar of resistance, he characterizes himself, has done some really eloquent writing about the very conservative and reactionary bargain that the Declaration of Independence was. And it's a voice that I've been following a lot lately and worthwhile. And yet, it was a profoundly startling and revolutionary document. It was, by our standards, enormously inadequate. By the standards of the time, a huge break with what was being said. It was a compromise. You had to get this, whatever, 75 or what number of people to agree on something, and there are horrible compromises built into it that plague us to this day. But they did what they did. They pledged their lives, their trust, their sacred honor. Most of them paid with their lives and their sacred honor and their fortunes. But it's valuable, despite the hypocrisy, it's valuable for the beacon that it sets out in the landscape, the aspiration that it's so. The fact that we all are judging it against the standards says that it has meaning for us. In our house, we actually read it aloud every 4th of July. It's
Cool.
very different read aloud than read on the page. And so, hypocrisy is not the worst thing in human affairs, because none of us is completely consistent. And the question is, how do we deal with that tension? Where do we go with that? And the phenomenon of a declaration is a really important one to consider. Chauncey Bell's got a great chapter in his book, Mobilize, about the power of the Speech Act of creating a reality in speech, bringing forth something new in how we speak. And that's been, threaded through the whole conversation of coherence, coercion, consideration, care, and all these other wonderful C words that seem to pepper our conversation. So thank you, everybody, for this. It's a great, great call. And I think we should post it.
Thank you, Gil. Are there any objections to my posting it? I normally these days, when it's okay to post, I've been posting unlisted. I would love to post this publicly. Any objections to that?
Mm-mm.
Are we good with that? I will do so. Kalia, who might have had a word, did not really jump into the conversation, so I think we're okay. So I will do that. And thank you.
Say that again, Jerry. How will you distribute it?
I will post it the way I used to, which is I'll put it on YouTube in public view. Is that okay?
Thanks all.
Cool. Thank you all very much. Really appreciate it. Ciao for now. DFTBA, don't forget to be awesome. Thank Lizzie, Mike.
That's
Yep.
Thank you, Jerry.
Bye all.
Adore you.
Yeah.
Adore you, Jerry. Thank you.
Thank you. Same here, Eve. Eve.